Thank you. Please be seated. It really is a rare privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Elizabeth Povinelli. And one could cite, by way of explanation for this enthusiasm, that she is the Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology, Gender, and at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University, and a corresponding fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. One could also mention, to explain this enthusiasm for her this evening, that she is the author of 8 books, any number of essays on, among other things, the settler colonialism in late liberalism, including her work, Geontologies, a requiem to late liberalism, which won the Lionel Trilling Award. One could also mention that she is also a founding member of the Caribbean Film Collective, with whom she has made a number of films that have garnered international acclaim, or that she, as one colleague from SAR, the School of Advanced Research right here in Santa Fe, described her, a major anthropological theorist. But if I'm honest, I might say that I'm really most excited because, given that we have so many parents in the audience, for Parents Weekend, that this outstanding intellectual is also a graduate of St. John's College, Santa Fe. Her lecture tonight is entitled Geontopower, the History of Thought as a Mode of Power. Elizabeth Povinelli.
Or that, or numerous other titles. First of all, thank you for that really wonderful introduction. It is indeed 40 years ago when I left St. John's here in Santa Fe, where I spent the 4 years. And 40 years ago, I left here and went to a small indigenous community in the north of Australia called Bellewen, where I have spent the last 40 years. Working alongside the indigenous families there. And about, I don't know, when 20 years ago or 19 years ago or something like that, when a group of us from Bellewen started the Catastrophe Film Collective. So it seemed right. I left Bellewen September 2nd and told them I was coming to the place that I journeyed toward them, and they said to tell you hello. When I was here, and just to give you a sense, I was the generation of Bill O'Grady, Nancy Buchenauer, who I've heard we've lost very recently, Susu Knight, and it was in some ways a very different campus, same curriculum. Always the same curriculum. I'm not really sure. I mean, imagine, there are those of you who might know Susan Knight. She's an amazing translator and poet who taught my calculus class. Smoking. I don't know what this fucking shit is about. Povinelli, Senyak, get up and try and explain it to me. All right. I'm really not sure I or we learned philosophy in a hermeneutic sense. That is, I'm not sure that that generation, William O'Grady's generation, Buchenauer's generation, was primarily interested in teaching us to read philosophical texts. They were quite committed to what the French philosopher Pierre Hadot called philosophy as a way of life. And it is that kind of, that approach to philosophy, that approach to thinking with many of the texts that many generations read here, that has primarily affected me as a thinker, as a filmmaker, and as a human being. Though you'll see today that in many ways I do an anti-philosophy and anti-St. John's Project, which I could only do having come here. The twists. Okay. I remember these Friday lectures well. So when the offer to come and do one, I thought long and hard about where to start, what to present, not merely with regard to my own corpus of work and how it relates to developments in contemporary critical thought, but I also thought about how to create a communicative line between my work, contemporary critical thought, and the St. John's curriculum that I remember so well, like how to do that. In the end, I decided I'd use the topic, where do we start when we wish to write an account of this or that world, or simply, where do we start? As a framework for tonight's lecture, which will begin by focusing on arguments that I've made in my last two books, and please don't read all these books. But I'm gonna do a kind of cliff notes of these two books because I want to set the scene for a project that my Cotabine colleagues and I are doing called Melting Glaciers, Rising Tides. And Melting Glaciers, Rising Tides asks the question, where do we begin when we want to put the region of my Povinelli and Ambrosi on my grandmother's side, the ancestral village that Ambrosis and Povinellis come from in the Alps, when we put the ecological condition of climate collapse and melting glaciers in a relation to the rising sea tides along Cotabine coastlines in the north. So hopefully I'll get there. So let me begin. Voila. Geontologies in Between Gaian Ground set out to examine how contemporary critical and artistic thought has been transformed as ongoing colonialism is felt and metabolized in the shadow of contemporary climate and ecological collapse. I'm particularly interested in the moods of this collapse when analyzed on two sides, to be simple, two sides of the colonial relation, the settler and indigenous, or colonized and colonizer. And by mood, of course, I'm in some ways gesturing toward Heidegger in the sense that a mood is disclosive of the world in which we are, but do not yet comprehend, and the way in which a mood tells us before precognitively what matters to us. So the mood that I try and explore in both of these books in relation to climate change, climate collapse, and ecological catastrophes are a relational mood that appears when you consider settler and indigenous forms, ways of inhabiting this ecological crisis. And in particular, I discuss the way in which from a European diasporic side, or in Europe itself, this catastrophe feels like one that's coming, that's on the horizon, that is a coming catastrophe. And from those who sit at the end of the pipeline of settler colonialism, The mood is perhaps one of an ancestral catastrophe. That is the difference between a coming and ancestral catastrophe. Now, the number of things to point out about the difference between a coming and an ancestral catastrophe. I just want to lay these out for a minute. The first is that the feeling of a coming catastrophe is how it might feel, or at least what it felt like when it was still coming versus it's all around. For those for whom the European invasions beginning in the 15th century provided the opportunity for the accumulation of wealth and the imaginary of a new horizon of civilizational progress. For those who benefited from the invasion and figured it as civilizational progress, this coming environmental and climate catastrophe is metabolized as a specific kind of event, right? A catastrophic remaking of the world. It's future inflected, it's on the way, and of course, as I say, it's apocalyptic. The simultaneous end and beginning of a new world. Now, as opposed to metabolizing climate catastrophe as a coming catastrophe, the ancestral catastrophe is a mood, indigenous mood, in relation to viewing discourse around, contemporary discourses around climate collapse. But it's a way of metabolizing or affectively comprehending this moment in a way that changes the event structure and the temporality. When we begin within the worlds who continue to experience, who experienced, these are some maps, who experience in Australia, Cottabing's right up, oh, I have a clicker. I think I had a clicker. Anyways, right up there, see that loop? And then toward that little inky thing there, inky thing, you go up, and then there's like a little thumb. That's where we are. A thumb, that's my southern. Okay. When we begin with the worlds who experience and then continue to experience ongoing colonialism and racism, the catastrophe isn't coming. It began a long time ago. The catastrophe keeps bubbling up from the ground in which they're living in multiple ways of territorialization, both in terms of the propertizing of their world, the extension of settlers, the settler invasion, the monetization through mining of their lands and their ancestral relations. Now, geontologies and between Gaia and ground focus on the critical, so the books say, okay, how do we think about what's happening in critical theory and artistic research practice if we read them from the perspective of not the catastrophe, but different relations to that catastrophe? And so if we're reading the critical theoretical disruptions from these two moods, two relational moods, then Geontologies as a book situates itself first in the disorienting nature of what has been called the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, depending on how you pronounce it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, the Anthropocene is a term that was popularized by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer, and it was an attempt to denote a geological age that came after the Holocene, that was coming after the Holocene, in which humans are the dominant influence on climate and climatic and environmental forms. And not only are they the dominant influence on climatic environmental forms, they are a destructive force, right? So it's not just, oh, look, we shape the world. It's like we're destroying the world. Now, as this concept, so it was, they're geologists, and they were like, okay, we think we're in a new geological formation. We're not in the Holocene anymore, we're in the Anthropocene. And as this geological conversation started trickling over into the humanities, the humanistic social sciences, and critical artistic practice, this concept, the Anthropocene, became not merely a proposal about a new geological age, but a term that started signifying the ravages of extractive and colonial capitalism. That is, immediately, critical theorists and critical artists started saying, wait a minute, this is not the Anthropocene, Anthropocene. Humans aren't destroying the world. A particular relation, social relations are destroying the world. And what we're really experiencing is the capitalocene, the plantationocene, the settlerocene, the Chutluocene. That is, there was a proliferation of concepts that emerged in which, in order to counter this history of man, right? We study the history of Geist, the history of man unfolding itself on the planet, humans unfolding themselves on the planet. Critical theorists, critical artists said, no, there's always a relational, there's a relation we have to think between those who have destroyed and accumulated the planet and now see a coming catastrophe, and those whose lands, ways of life, bodies, were devoured so that some could accumulate, who experienced the catastrophe as ancestral. Now, just for the record, the Royal Society, or whatever it's called, the Royal Society of Geology, has formally rejected the proposal that we are in a new geological age. Primarily because nobody can agree about where to put the little spike. Do you put it in the Industrial Revolution? Do you put it when the first European boats started invading the world? Do you put it, where do you put it? But whether an official designation or not, the concept of the Anthropocene rippled not only across the humanities and humanistic social sciences, but the sciences themselves. Right? And Geontology, the book, examined in particular how this new planetary focus disrupted a long-standing, in the heart, the natural sciences too, a long-standing practice that treated life and non-life as external or exterior to one another. That is, life is on one side and non-life is on the other. They're external to each other. What the crisis of the ecological, the climatic, and now the crisis of that this concept, the Anthropocene, put front and foremost in people's minds, is that there is no way of, from a planetary point of view, no way of separating parts of existence that we could call life and parts of existence we call non-life. They are in an extimate relation to each other. They are interior to each other. So first, what Geontologies tried to do was first to address how the management, it's like, okay, well, what's happening to thought here? What's happening to thought as this relational crisis is rippling across intellectual thought? And first of all, the first book, Geontologies, tried to address how the management of the division of life and non-life, and it's a management of the division, life, non-life, which ones go into which side, on the basis of what, et cetera, has long, I say to people, look, this division has long functioned as in some ways, a propositional hinge in Wittgenstein's sense. I saw Wittgenstein on the shelves. Do you guys read Wittgenstein now? Yes, okay. Anyways, not that anyways, many things we have to say about efficacy. Anyways, it's a propositional hinge, life, non-life. It's a propositional hinge, an axle around which an entire apparatus of practical and propositional knowledge about the world turns, rather than a set of propositions about the state of the world. So it's not life or non-life that were being disrupted as this crisis emerged for some newly. It's not life or non-life per se, but the way in which this relational division allowed the organization as common sense of a multitude of forms of disciplinary knowledge and common sense. So, crudely, in the natural sciences, it allowed for the kind of ease. I mean, it's just like, for a long time, it's like totally like relaxed biology, geology, right? No anxiety here. It also allowed the ways of relating without making equivalent divisions such as biology and geology to philosophical questions about Dasein, about finitude, right? Because on the one side of life encompasses all things that can be born, that can unfold, and most importantly are defined by the fact that they can die, right? And on the other side, again, relaxed, things that come into the existence fully actualized. You read that about in Aristotle, right? In many ways you think, well, rocks already figured it all out. They don't have to actualize, they're done. They came into existence already done. We should aspire to be a rock. Also, just so you know, this division between life and non-life, so formal, also organized ethical and political focus, right? And created the background conditions that allowed this focus to accumulate its energies. By that I simply mean the division between life and non-life allowed both ethics and politics to focus on things of life that could develop, that could unfold its potential. And within the hierarchy of life, organized the politics of killing, destroying, killing and murdering. Right? And in the background was this non-life that you could just destroy, like you can just you can just mine the crap out of anything, but you destroy, but you neither kill nor murder, right? So it just allowed this, and again, very common sense way. Second, Geontology's discussed how the shock of the Anthropocene, or some capitalist scene, the plantation scene, the settler scene, how the shock of the Anthropocene in territories that benefited from colonialism and racism came to understand that the divisions between life and non-life that were part and parcel about how this accumulation could occur were not merely an artificial way of dividing existence, but it was life-threatening. Now, life, for those who had benefited, primarily the life threat, was a planetary perspective, right? So the worry was about the planetary perspective. And that's the third thing, and this is very cliff notey, but the third thing that Geontology's tried to do is say that, well, wait a minute, let's back up and say that while the division between life and non-life, that which comes into existence as something we could describe as life, born, unfolds, dies, and comes to understand whether it actualized its potential or not, the fact of that finitude, and non-life, this division has deep roots in Western philosophy. If anyone knows, you guys know in here. But the point is, for Geontopower, is not, that this is an old Western obsession that gets carted around the world on boats, but rather that this division was weaponized during the conquests of the Americas and across the Pacific Oceans. And it was weaponized as a way of justifying the violence of colonialism. Oh, where's my little guy? It doesn't matter. Here we go. Discipline, or sure, okay. The meanings and deployments of life and non-life are not thus simply a question of Aristotle. We all know, of course, that there's the Aristotelian way of doing it, then the debates here, there's not a homogeneous organization of what life and non-life is. But what happened during the conquest of the Americas, of the Pacifics, is that this Western common sense division was used to rank and organize the peoples of the encounter. So, say when this is in, some of us in Australia, when conquest reaches Australia, we'll see later, the image of the Stone Age people emerges, right? So that the concept of the stone as that which can be destroyed, can be replaced, removed, but no killing or murdering happened, came again as a kind of Wittgensteinian hinge to justify vicious practices of extermination that were metabolized and presented as putting people back into their right time. They were in the Stone Age, they came from the Stone Age, so it's a natural progression that white settlers would come and they would just end up back in the Stone Age where they belonged. So geontology is focused on the disorganization of the governance of the division between life and non-life, and the disorientation that this disorganization presented. And in particular, it focused on three figures. The desert, the animus, and the virus. And I won't go into much here. The point is that we're in critical theory, in critical artistic practice, in the sciences, across the board. I mean, we really saw just this rippling across the disciplines. Inside the disciplines, all of these common sense forms of division and relation stopped working, right? And there were attempts to try and rethink them. So, the division between life and non-life makes no sense from a planetary perspective. When we're thinking about climate change, we can't say, well, life things and non-life things are inside each other, right? This was not in existence, this was a way of governing existence, and this way of governing existence actually is destroying the planet. What do we do, right? And part of what the book was thinking is like, okay, what are people doing? What is emerging as new figures? What do they think will solve this, overcome this opposition? And so three figures, if you just kind of move across these disciplines, three figures emerge. One was the desert. Oh no, Earth is going to be like the moon, or better, Mars, the dead planet. And the figure of the desert started emerging everywhere. Not that, and again, it's a figure. Deserts are very lively. We live in a desert. Right? But it's a figure, this mood, oh my God, if we don't do something, we will all be non-life. The animist, which was a figure, don't worry, everything, don't worry about non-life, everything is lively. This is lively, that lively, it's all an assemblage, right? So you try and solve it First, by freaking out on one side. Second, by pulling everything in existence into the other side. And then there's a third really interesting figure that people, and really in academic presentations and artistic presentations, people say, you know, the animist is, no, that's not working because that still is all about life. You know what we need? The virus and the fungus. And especially the virus, because the virus takes advantage of the discipline, but is itself not ruled by it, right? So, you know, in part I was just going, what are people doing here? But the reason I wanted to know what people were doing here was to set up the second book, which is Between Gaia and Ground. And if people are being disrupted by, on the side, I'm really talking about on the side of thought that has really deep and embedded roots in the kind of curriculum taught here. That do critical theory, which is the kind of the granddaughter of philosophy. Wow, I don't know if I can say that. But anyways, I did. I could read post-colonial theory really well after St. John's. What I wanted to do in Between Gaia and Ground, the kind of the second part of the second book in this series, I wanted to take this mood, this anxiety, this attempt to refigure thought in the moment as climate change is happening, and look at how this reorganization of thought, this development of new kind of thought figures, was affecting the hierarchy of the faculty. Do you guys read that Kant? No? You don't read the hierarchy of the faculty? Who is in charge of this program? He really meant the faculty in like the theology on top, then law, then philosophy. Yeah, so, you know, Kant was in the time where philosophy is right on the bottom. I won't say where it belongs. I will not say that. No, I like it. Anyways, but I was, you know, again, I'm so marked by this place. So I was interested in how is this crisis reorganizing the hierarchy of the faculties, by which I meant the disciplines. And one of the things that is still going on was very clear, very quickly, is that as folks were thinking, oh my God, what have we been doing? We've been separating forms of existence in a way that's destroying the life of the planet. And we also know that this separation of forms of existence were weaponized during the colonial period so that it maintained a hierarchy of people, so you could justify the vicious enslavement of men and women and destroy lands and ecosystems in West and East and Southern Africa as you were destroying lands across what was called the Americas, right? So we also see the way in which this division, those kinds of people in civilizations, as Geist unfolds itself, who have the power or on the power to unfold civilization itself versus those other ones who are, you get the drift, right? As this is creating huge amounts of anxiety, and I really mean the affect, I'm talking about affect, right? An affect of anxiety. What are we doing? What have we been doing? What are we going to do? They're merged in, I would say, critical theory, but a critical theory across anthropology and philosophy and humanities and et cetera. They're merged these four statements, four propositions maybe, that really just became axiomatic. You'd show up anywhere and these are the four things you would hear. First, existence is entangled, i.e. life is in non-life and this life is in this life. You know, my gut biome, we all know now, but existence is entangled. Right? There's not this and this tied together. the conditions of this body are outside itself. And, right? And often, this, in the beginning, people would just stop there as if that was the politics. Existence and take, look, in order for me to exist, I need to be in a biome, the relation between my inner biome and the outer biome have to be in the right place. The second statement was social worlds distribute, so if existence is entangled, the second proposition was about, or the fact that social worlds distribute the benefits and costs of that entanglement differently. Okay. So simply, as I said before, existence is entangled. The way in which racial and colonial conquest manipulated that existential, that ontological entanglement meant that all things that were considered goods and values were taken and flowed in one direction, and all the toxicities and costs of getting those values flowed in another. The third proposition or statement that you'd hear is that because existence is entangled and social worlds manipulate how that entanglement flows goods and toxicities, then politics and the political event have to be thought of in relation to, number one, that it's entangled, and number two, how it's entangled, how social worlds affect the flow of material in the entanglement. The fourth proposition or statement was that, oh, remember that Western liberal epistemologies and ontologies, or what I was calling Geontopower, emerged in the entangled histories of colonialism and slavery, and indeed are part and parcel of the ongoing differential relations of materialization, all of which is to say, like everyone would also say, and by the way, the disciplines that we practice, English, literature, philosophy, anthropology, I don't know what other disciplines are there. Got to be more than those three. Political science, etc. They themselves are after effects of the way in which the separations of life and non-life and their weaponization occurred. Okay, so voila. The book isn't interested in any one of these axioms. This is what critical theory looks like today. I'm not in the book or today interested in saying that one's right, that one's wrong, that one's right, that one's wrong. I'm not interested in that. Instead, what I'm interested in is the organization, not only the organization of the disciplines or the hierarchy of the disciplines that we can see in here, but rather, what are we doing? What are we, well, I'll just say doing. What are we doing when we organize the disciplines in this way? So, what are the disciplines? You begin with ontology. What is existence? Existence is. So you start, now I'm not saying you should start. I'm saying, no, I'm not saying that, please, sorry. People are starting, those people. No, we're starting, what about that? We're starting with an ontological claim. Existence is entangled. Right? And remember, the first book, Geontology, says, what if we remember that the way in which the division, this long-standing philosophical division between life and non-life, the way it layered into biology, the natural sciences, critical sciences, itself emerged in the relation of colonialism and emerged in a way in which colonialism used this division in order to justify the extraction of what it considered goods in one direction and leaving the toxicity of that extraction in another place. What if you start like that? And so, what if we start by saying, okay, and that didn't just happen, but rather that path work continues to happen. We have climate collapse, climate crisis. Let's, you hear we need green energy. Where's the material for those solar panels and batteries coming from? They're coming from the places that have already been devastated and where the toxicity's been left. Often you hear sacrifice zone. Well, it's already destroyed, we might as well destroy it more. No, seriously. For the benefit of clean energy in other places. Okay, so let's get back to this. So existence is entangled. We start from a general ontological claim. Is anyone implicated in that claim? Right? Or do we have that in common? We have in common that existence is entangled. Start with ontology, we are told. Second, move from ontology to the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, right? Maybe history, that look at the specificities of how this ontological condition is mobilized in different social worlds. Then we build politics out of that, and then we say, oh, by the way, all of this, these disciplines are effects of the ancestral catastrophe of colonialism. One of the things that, of course, someone like me starts saying is, who and why do we want to start with an ontological condition? And here's where I wanted to turn to you guys, y'all, in this program, right? This hierarchy of the disciplines is, we could say, it is now rampant in critical theory and artistic practice. But it's not thoroughly new. I'm not sure if you know Judith Butler's work. They're a critical theorist, wrote did gender trouble, a lot of the performative stuff around gender, but in the 2000s wrote a book on war, and in particular on the question of grievability. And what Butler did was to say, what we need to begin with, if we're going to think about war and grievability, that is, whose deaths matter. And we could also say the destruction of whose worlds matter. Who's grievable? What's grievable? She didn't say what, she's very humanistic. But anyways, who's grievable? The way, and Judith is a philosopher, so they begin by saying, the first thing we have to do is say that all human beings come into existence in a state of precarity. We can't take care of ourselves, right? We need someone to take care of us. But what happens is that different kinds of social worlds, capitalist, liberal, non-liberal, illiberal, take this common condition and they distribute it unequally so that some people live in precarity while others don't feel the nature of their own precariousness at all. They cocoon themselves on the basis of distributing precarity to others. Why does Butler think we should move this way? Because when we go to war, and it could be war in a little w, it could be war in a big W, it could be war in the sense of, look, I don't care about you. Or it could be war. That for Butler, if we remember that we all share a ontological condition of precarity. When I go to, I don't know, murder you or attack you or treat you with disdain, I'll look in your eyes and I'll see that we have something in common. And that will keep me from doing what I was going to do to you. Oh, you're like me. I wouldn't want anyone to do that to me. What Between Guy and Ground tries to do is say, am I being videoed? Yes, then I won't swear. What the heck? What? You have to be like me, or I can just treat you with disdain, right? There is no other way of being in relation that doesn't start with removing myself from that, what I've been calling the relational materializations of ongoing settler capitalism. If you remember, and again, this is very quick, I'm going to have to stop. If we remember that this long-standing division between life and non-life, that is just a philosophical question that got metabolized into the sciences, the disciplines, mining, war. If we remember that that was weaponized during the conquest period in order to justify the relations of extraction, right? The movement of peoples and lands and goods so that some could accumulate without worrying or grieving about, to use Butler, grieving about those whose lives and worlds were destroyed. Where do we begin? Should we begin by removing ourselves from the way in which we continue to be situated in that relation, whether we like it or not? Whether we like it or not. That the conditions that were set in place and continue so that some bodies and lands are materialized for the good life on the basis of, and it doesn't come from nowhere, the basis of other bodies, lands being the subject of that. Who, and here's a who wants to start with what we have in common? And here I won't get to rising tides, but I'll go back to the moods of the coming climate, the two moods of the ancestral and the coming catastrophe. For those, argument, for those for whom the catastrophe is coming, is that sandstorm on the horizon that's going to obliterate their good life. For those folks, well, it could be anybody in this room, for those folks, me, whoever, that cloud coming toward them should be diagnostic of where they are located in that relational materialization. If you feel that cloud is coming for you, you've been benefiting from this. For those for whom the ancestral crisis is the crisis of ecological collapse is ancestral. There's a great picture of oil spills in Nigeria bubbling out of the ground. Right? It's not coming. It's been bubbling out of the ground. Henry DeMoss, beautiful story. Goodbye, Sweetwater. Read that. The Ancestral Catastrophe. Which one of these sides feels that it's right to start by removing themselves from that relation? Who thinks it's the good to start by saying, no, we share something in common. That's where we should start. We should start where we're not implicated. Versus those who might say, maybe we should start number 4. Maybe I don't really care what the world is in some abstract, historically, politically, and socially removed place. What we need to care about is figuring out where we are in that relational materialization and begin changing the direction of the poison. And that means some of us are going to have to swallow it. Thank you.